My name is Dr. Daniel Jones. I'm a public health registrar and I am the Deputy Chair for Terms and Conditions on the Welsh Resident Doctors Committee. The purpose of this presentation is to give you an idea of the terms and conditions of your employment when you start working as an F1 in August. This presentation will cover the terms and conditions of service for F1 doctors working across the four nations of the United Kingdom, but in particular Wales. I'll aim to cover as much information as possible throughout the talk, but if you do have any questions, please either visit the BMA website or if you are a BMA member, contact our team of advisors who will be happy to help you. I will provide their contact details at the end of the presentation. You may be aware that there are two sets of terms and conditions of service for resident doctors in the UK. The terms and conditions of service, which is often abbreviated to TCS, that apply in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, were introduced in 2002 and are known as the New Deal. Currently, the TCS remain broadly the same in the three devolved nations, but there are minor differences which I will draw to your attention. Really importantly, please be aware that in Wales, we have re-entered contract negotiations for resident doctors in Wales in order to modernise and improve our TCS. The negotiations are advanced now, and at least for the time being, the TCS in Wales will remain the same as described in this presentation. However, anyone staying in Wales to continue their training may be affected in the near future by any negotiations that produce an agreement that then goes to members for referendum. It is very important that you stay up to date on that progress if you're working in Wales, and again, I'll speak more about this later. The terms and conditions in England were introduced in 2016 with major contract review in 2018 and further amendments in 2019. In order to avoid resident doctors having to go through the same pre-employment checks every time they move hospitals or employers, there's been a gradual introduction of single lead employers for hospital-based resident doctors and in some instances GP registrars across the UK. In Wales, the single lead employer model for GP registrars was introduced some years ago, and then for hospital-based resident doctors, it was introduced for F1s from September 2020 and has since onboarded nearly every resident doctor in Wales. The single lead employer in Wales is also known as the NHS Shared Services Partnership, or NHSWSSP. There are four lead employers in Scotland: NHS Lothian, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, NHS Grampian and NHS Education for Scotland. The Northern Ireland Medical and Dental Training Agency has its own single lead employer model for resident doctors there. There are several lead employers in England, and if you are moving there, I would suggest that you contact your educational provider for more information. If you move between nations or education providers during the course of your training, your lead employer will change and you may need to go through the pre-employment and enrolment checks and processes again. Right, so now onto your contractual rights, and firstly we're going to look at your basic pay. So on the left hand side are the current salaries for an F1 doctor under the 2002 contract, and you can see slight differences between the three different devolved nations. So this is for a basic 40-hour working week, and then on the right hand side under the 2016 contract you can see what an F1 doctor gets in England. Under the 2002 contract, you will usually start at the minimum point of the pay scale, and then you'll progress through the pay scale with every year of service, regardless of whether you're working full-time or less than full-time, or you take statutory leave. And depending on what exactly it is, if you have prior experience working in the NHS, it may be possible to count that towards your pay progression as well before you start as an F1. In the 2016 contract in England, pay is linked to 5 nodal points, and they are strictly determined by your training grade. And so in this case, there is a nodal point just for F1 doctors, and the amount is reached there. And also in England, if you are living or working in London, then you may be entitled to London waiting, and there are two zones, a London zone and a fringe zone. Different rates apply to them, and again, employment advisors will be able to help you with that if you're unsure if it applies to you. Each year the pay scales are reviewed by the Doctors and Dentists Review Body, which makes recommendations to the various governments on what to do on pay. We have had the recommendations for the 25-26 pay award, so the figures you're seeing on this are out of date. However, it's important to note that in England there is a current pay dispute. Northern Ireland and Wales are still determining what their response to the award will be. In particular in Wales, we are still in contract negotiations that may have implications for pay. And in Scotland, they will be seeking direct pay negotiations. The salaries here are based on a 40-hour working week. We know that for many of you, your average weekly working hours will be greater than that, and that they will encompass antisocial hours because of all of the out-of-hours work and shift work that you have to do. The average weekly working hours should not be greater than 48 hours, and that is set down in law due to the working time regulations. Unless you have specifically opted out of those regulations via a form. Also to note that that means that you will get supplements, and what you'll see is that the supplements in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are quite significant compared to the out-of-hours supplements that you tend to see in England. So again, the total pay, your total take-home pay, is actually pretty comparable across the nations, just to note. If you're planning on working less than full-time, under the 2016 contract, the pay is pro rata. Under the 2002 contract, it will depend on the total number of hours you work. And so if you are working a full-time rota of the maximum average of 48 hours a week, and then you decide to go down to 80% less than full-time, it is actually possible that you will end up with your pay pro rata at 90% rather than 80%. So those scenarios do exist. It's a bit of a fairer system, and again, if you're in that situation, then you can get advice from the BMA under which band you should be in. And then the last thing on this slide to note is that only your basic pay is pensionable. So you pay pension contributions and your employer pays pension contributions on your basic pay. The 2015 NHS pension scheme is a career average earning scheme, so the pension money that you're getting now is very relevant. It all counts, and in the case of your out-of-hours pay, your banding supplements, just to note, or in England, your additional hours and your enhanced rate supplements, it's just to note that those will not attract pension contributions either from yourself or your employer. So you'll take a bit more of the pay home for those, but it won't be going into your pension pot for later. So this graph gives a visual representation of the comparison between the two pay structures across your whole typical career, just to help you visualize it a bit more. So you can see here that under the 2016 contract in England, that the basic pay is a bit higher across the total, and again, it is a relative ratio. So in England, they pay a bit more basic pay and less in out of hours. Under the 2002 contract, there is less in basic pay but more in out of hours pay. And you can see that just looking at basic pay, that as well as being a little bit higher, the 2016 English pay scale is front loaded, so you get more of it earlier on in your career, and it comes in jumps, and those jumps are linked to your training grades. So there may be years where you don't go up or progress along the pay scale. Under the 2002 contract, you will progress every year, so it's quite a flattened out pay scale. You don't really see that much front loading, and it's just to note that it remains years in service pay progression under 2002, so you continue to progress through these pay points, regardless of if you're less than full time, you take statutory leave, you go off and do an out of program experience, etc. That all counts. And a hazard warning again with these pay figures and this graph, that it hasn't taken into account the 25-26 DDRB recommendations or the potential contract reform that may be occurring in Wales. Now we'll just talk about additional hours, and in the 2002 contract, the additional hours are reflected in the banding supplement, which I'll talk about in detail later. In England, they are specifically set out on an hours worked model. So you get 1/40th of your weekly whole-time equivalent salary for each hour over the 40 hours on average a week you work, up to the maximum of 8 hours, so 48 in total. And so for unsocial work, or work that is outside of plain time, again, this is recognised via your banding supplement under the 2002 contract. And for the calculation purposes, plain time is Monday to Friday, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Anything outside of this is considered enhanced or premium time. In England, the system is slightly more complicated. You get a 37% enhancement for what are essentially nights, and that is any work between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. any day of the week. And there are provisions around that, around when the shift starts and finishes, just to ensure that nothing goes untoward with rostering, and that if you are effectively working a late evening, that you get paid properly for it. And that's set out here. And then for weekend day work, again, in 2002 contract, that feeds into your banding. It helps the calculation in terms of your premium time. In England, weekend day work is technically considered plain time rather than premium time, but the contract does remunerate you for it in a different mechanism called the weekend frequency allowance, and that is basically a percentage of your basic salary paid as a top-up, and that is determined by how many weekends you're doing over a rota cycle. And so typically we might see 1 in 3, 1 in 4, in which case you're getting up towards 15% of your basic pay as an additional payment. And so lastly but not least is non-residential on-call work as part of additional work. And just to be specific, so non-residential on-call work is where you are typically off-site, typically at home, and you are available to either give advice over the telephone or to return to work if you are called in. It's not typically something we see F1s do, but it may be something that you do on certain rotations or certain specialties later on in your career. And just to note that in hospitals, you will often see people assigned on to on-call shifts and holding on-call bleeps, but for the purposes of your contract, on-call typically means non-residential on-call work, and that means not being on site. In the 2002 contract, that again just goes into your banding and it's used to calculate your banding. In the 2016 contract in England, you are paid an 8% allowance of your basic pay just for being on the rota, and then there is an attempt to work out how much average work you typically do on a shift, and again that feeds into your additional work and to your weekend frequency allowance and the like. So just quickly in summary, your total salary will be made up of different components. Under the 2002 contract, it straightforwardly is your basic pay and your banding supplements, and that will be a regular payment that you get on the equivalent of 1/12 of the annual figure, and you'll get that every month. Under the 2016 contract, as we've set out, you'll get your basic pay. The prospective hours across the rota cycle will be used to estimate averages that you'll be working, and that will translate into additional hours payments for every hour on average you do above the 40-hour mark. If you do any nights, you'll get enhancement rates for those nights. If you do any weekends, you will get a weekend frequency allowance based on the frequency. And then finally, if you do any non-residential on-call work, you'll get an availability allowance and you'll get paid for any of the on-call work you do. And that typically is all set out in your work schedule, which you should get about 8 weeks before you start in post. And then the average hours calculations are all converted into a weekly figure. That is then converted into an annual figure, and you'll get 1/12 of that every month. So even though it seems like quite a complicated calculation, you should get a consistent amount of pay every month, both on the 2016 contract and on the 2002 contract. So I'm just going to talk about the banding system now. The banding system is a key part of the 2002 contract and how it ensures that any additional hours you do and any out of hours work you do are fairly remunerated. And this will typically be on more generous terms that you've seen on the 2016 contract, because the 2016 contract has a higher proportion of pay in basic pay versus the 2002 contract. And just to say that every full-time resident doctor on the 2002 contract across the devolved nations will be working on a rota that falls into one of these pay bands, or otherwise you will be unbanded. If you are unbanded, that means that you're typically working a 40-hour working week, and that all of the hours you do are between Monday to Friday, 7 to 7. And therefore you're doing something more like a regular office job. If you're working more than 40 hours, then you will get a banding, and there are various different calculations depending on whether you are working on an on-call rota, how many hours you're doing outside of playing time, what weekend frequency allowance is. There is a banding calculator available on the BMA to help you work through that, and you will be notified of your banding once you start employment. And just to note that when you rotate, if you're going to a new post, the banding may change. And finally, if you are unbanded as an F1, just to reflect the fact that the basic pay can be quite low in that situation, you will get an extra 5% payment as a bit of a top up. Under the 2016 contract, there are additional pay supplements. Just to highlight, these were put in for a variety of reasons, and some of that will be hard to fill specialties. So, for example, psychiatry and emergency medicine and histopathology. There is a clinical academic pay premium for people who do integrated academic training, so later on in their career, and go off, do a PhD and then come back on to training. And there is also a pay premium for GPs, GP registrars I should say, and resident doctors who go on to do oral max facs. And these were set down as absolute amounts, but as part of the recent pay deal in England before the current disputes, these will now be uplifted in line with the pay recommendations each year. So these amounts are what they were previously, but it's just to note that these will actually be going up slightly every year, and you should check the BMA website to see the most up-to-date ones. So as you should have been able to see throughout this presentation, the pay that you get will depend on your working pattern. And in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, on the 2002 contract, the way that that works out is your rota will fulfill a specific criteria of banding, or it may not be banded at all. And then depending on what that is, you will be able to straightforwardly calculate your pay. In England, as we've already mentioned, there are a number of calculations for additional hours, enhanced rates, etc. And that should all be set out on a work schedule that you will get before you start your post. What is below is an example of a rota in Wales. It includes on-call duties, which F1s do not do. So non-residential on-call, I should say, but it does give an idea of what a rota would look like. It's based on a 5-week cycle, which means that there are only 5 doctors on this particular rota. This would be quite an intense one, and you can see that there's a high frequency of out of hours work, and so this rota is likely to attract a band 1A, so that would be a 50% supplement, or depending on whether people were having to do overtime, staying late, etc., it may even get up to 2A and attract an 80% supplement. Within your F1 year, you'll have 3 rotations or placements. Each one will have a different rota and different out of hours commitments. So every time you rotate, your total pay might change. It might well fluctuate across the year. So under the 2002 contract, all you need to work out what your total salary should be is to work out your pay points, and you can do that on the BMA website, and then to ask what banding does the rota attract. And if you're unsure whether that banding is correct, you can use the BMA website and our banding calculator. Under the 2016 contract, you'll only really be able to work out what you need when you get your work schedule, and that is all set out. And again, the BMA is looking to develop a payslip calculator to help crunch through the quite complicated pay calculations that you get under the 2016 contract, just to make sure that it's correct. But if you're just glancing at it, then these are some key questions to ask below. So are you working more than 40 hours? Are you working any weekends? Are you working nights? Are you doing any non-residential on call? Because those should all get additional points and payments onto your payslip. And I mentioned it a bit already, but if you are working in England, you will get a work schedule. We are developing a rota checker that will go through that. And again, it will make sure that it's in order, and it will try and give you an idea of what your pay should be. So I'm just going to talk through working hours and rest safeguards now. So this will be set out in the contract, either to the 2002 contract or the 2016 contract. And on top of this, there are also the working time regulations, which are set out in law. They will both apply simultaneously. There is an overlap, but generally whichever one is the most beneficial to you will be the one that will apply. Most of you will start on a full shift rota. And the limits and the rest requirements under the 2002 contract is set here. So you get 30 minutes after 4 hours of work as an example of natural breaks, and then you can see some of the rostering limits set out. And then similarly in England, you will get your 30-minute breaks depending on how many hours you work. So if you work more than 5 hours, you'll get a 30-minute break, and then you'll get a second one if you work more than 9 hours. And then if it's a night shift of 12 hours or more, you'll get a third 30-minute break. As you can see from all the various limits set out, this can be quite a complicated business. Your rotas and your work schedules should be compliant because they're put through appropriate software. But if you have any concerns that you're falling outside of these parameters, then again, go to the BMO website or contact one of our employment advisors. I'm just going to talk about the Working Time Directive as well. So that was originally an EU initiative, but it's been set out in law now, despite the UK leaving the EU. And it is there to prevent employers from requiring employees to work excessively long hours. And it's a health and safety initiative fundamentally. The rest requirements in the contracts are typically better than what's set out in the working time regulations. But if there is a situation where the working time regulations are better, then they will apply. It's not possible to opt out of the rest requirements here. You do need to ensure that you take necessary breaks, and employers should encourage and support you to do that. However, it is possible to opt out of some of the other provisions. And so, for example, you can work more than the average 48 hours a week, and you can work up to an average of 56 hours a week. And you can do that by signing an opt-out clause. But the resident doctors committees across the BMA in the UK believe that this option should only be retained for doctors who are able to determine their own working hours. It should not be part of a standard post or role. If you have agreed to an opt-out, then it's absolutely vital to ensure that all of that additional work that you're doing is appropriately recognised and paid. And just to say that, at least currently, there is no nationally agreed system to opt out. It would be something that you would do on an individual basis. Your employer should never present you with an opt-out as a requirement to start the post. They should never put it into the contract itself, and they should not make it a requirement for your training or a particular placement. If you are provided with an opt-out, you are not obliged to complete it. The working time regulations are there to protect you, and if you do encounter this problem at all, then again, please get in touch with us. And if you're working excess hours or overtime, what do you do? So this is quite a frequent issue. Under the 2002 contract, you are meant to get monitoring of your rota every 6 months. And so that is an exercise that you typically do in electronic software, where you essentially keep a diary sheet and you set out what work you've done and where. All of your colleagues will do that, and then that can be crunched in. And that will then be used to calculate your banding. And if you are working excess hours and not getting breaks, if you're going beyond what the banding is for that placement, then you will get a new banding calculation assigned. And it's really important that if you are working excess hours overtime, if you feel you're not getting your breaks, that you can always request monitoring. You should do this in email or writing. And if you have not had a rota monitoring exercise in the last 6 months, you can also request it then. The employer is contractually obliged to do monitoring, and on the flip side, you are contractually obliged to participate in monitoring. So if your employer asks you to do rota monitoring, please do it. You are required to do it, and it does help to work out what the banding should be. And we do see cases where people are working excess overtime, the monitoring exercise is performed, and their banding goes up as a result, and then you get better pay for what you do, and the employer is motivated to change the rota. And all of the additional pay will be backdated as well from the point at which you requested the monitoring. So the earlier you do it, the better. Under the 2016 contract, it is an hours worked more individual model, and therefore the mechanism is something called exception reporting, overseen by a guardian of safe working. And so that will be a system in place that allows you to report any overtime you do via electronic software, as well as missed training opportunities. And that will all go to either your supervisor or to the guardian of safe working, and it is possible for you to be compensated either with pay or with time off in lieu, and it's an important mechanism for raising safety concerns. We do recognise that there have been significant cultural and implementation issues with exception reporting. The Resident Doctors Committee in England have recently been able to secure reform to the processes. That is in the process of implementation and contractualisation, and so there will be a lot of forthcoming guidance about the changes, and hopefully it will lead to an improvement in the situation. And just to talk about safeguards in the context of excessive hours, unsafe hours, In the 2002 contract, that takes the form of higher bands. So your band 2s and your band 3s, especially band 3, which is 100%, so it effectively doubles your basic pay. Bands 2 and 3 are designed to disincentivize employers from breaching rest requirements. Not only are they very expensive, but again, as part of the contract, once you get into band 2 or 3, your employer has to attempt to get you back into band 1. In the 2016 contract, the Guardian of Safe Working can levy a fine, and there are certain criteria that are set out in the contract, which describe scenarios where the Guardian may do that. And then the fine money, some of it will go to the resident doctor, depending on the specific circumstances. Most of it will go into a central pot that is overseen by a resident doctor forum, and every resident doctor in the trust will be able to attend that resident doctor forum and vote in it. And the resident doctor forum basically decides how to spend the money. Generally, it is used for well-being or training purposes. So just on annual leave now, under the 2002 contract, as a full-time F1 with less than 5 years reckonable service in the NHS, you are entitled to 5 weeks annual leave. You're also entitled to 8 bank holidays and an additional 3 days known as statutory days, which are either specified or they're converted into annual leave. And then in Wales and Northern Ireland, you may find that leave is fixed in advance of your rota, so you get given it and assigned, and you may have to organise swaps with colleagues. That is an ambition for contract reform for us to get rid of it, so hopefully it's not something that we have to put up with for too much longer. In Scotland, due to a wellbeing agreement that they previously did a couple of years ago, fixed leave is the exception. It can still be used exceptionally, but you have to be notified 6 weeks in advance, and the swaps can be facilitated by the employer rather than you having to do it yourself. Under the 2016 contract, your leave is outlined in days, and you're entitled to 27 days as a full-time F1 plus the 8 bank holidays. Fixed leave is not permitted under the 2016 contract in England, and under the 2016 contract, provided that you request leave 6 weeks in advance, generally your employer should grant that, and it definitely has to be granted for a life-changing event, and to a degree that has to be determined by yourself, but the example that is frequently given would be a wedding. And for both the 2002 and 2016 contracts, is just to emphasize again that generally you have to give 6 weeks notice. It may be granted with less than 6 weeks notice, but it doesn't have to be. You need ideally to get it in before. If you're rostered to work a bank holiday, then you do have to do it, but you will get a day back in lieu, which you can then use as normal annual leave. And if you are unable to take all your leave by the end of the year through no fault of your own, you should either get it paid or you can carry it over to your next post if that is possible with your particular employer. However, if you're approaching this, you should flag it with your employer beforehand. And again, if you're having any issues, just come to the BMA. Just to note that annual leave, again, it does go up after a set number of years. So that's typically 5 years under both contracts. Once you do that, in the 2002 contract, you'll get an additional week. In England, you'll get an additional 5 days. Locums. So F1 doctors are limited in the locums that they can do because you don't have full registration with the GMC as of yet. You just have provisional registration at this point. Under the 2002 contract, you can pick up locum shifts up to 48 hours a week, and that can be increased to 56 hours a week if you have opted out of the working time regulations. Under the 2016 contract, there is a stipulation that if you are considering locum work, that you first make an offer to your local staff bank, which you should be on, rather than going to a locum agency. If you do choose to do locum work at any time, make sure that you agree the rates before you actually do it in advance, get it in writing. And just to note that this is extra contractual work, so although employers will set out rates, rate cards, maximums, etc., it is perfectly possible for you to negotiate the individual locum rate. It's not set out in the contract. It is absolutely there for you to have a bit of back and forth with them if you want, until you get a locum rate that you are happy with. Other considerations, so just getting towards the end now, employers are legally required to provide your written statement of your contract, and that's typically a front sheet, and you have to get that no later than first day in your post, and we do find that generally they do that. However, it is common and best practice for it to be sent to you before you do the post, and again, at least in Wales, we generally do find that they do that. Payday, it's normally around the 20th of the month or thereabouts, but you'll be paid for the whole month. In Scotland, resident doctors are paid on the last Thursday of every month, except from December when payroll runs around a week earlier. In Northern Ireland, payday is on the third last banking day of the month. Pay slips are now provided electronically on the NHS ESR, and would strongly recommend that as you get your pay slips, that you look at them, you download and save them, because they're a really useful record and reference to have. F1 doctors typically all start their roles on the first Wednesday in August. In Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, you'll get a 4-day shadowing or induction period immediately before starting your post, and this will be paid. This will be paid at basic salary rate only. You won't get banding for this particular point. In England, there will typically be induction shadowing periods as well. This is discretionary in terms of payment, and it does depend on the employer, but generally we find that more and more employers just pay what you would earn under the normal contract, and that is definitely something that you can push and that we are pushing for more of. It's worth noting that in Wales, F1 accommodation is free. It is classed by HMRC as a taxable benefit, so just to note that you may get a tax bill or an adjustment in the following financial year if you do take up the offer of free accommodation. You're also entitled to reasonable time for study under the 2002 and 2016 contracts with both of them. It is strictly stipulated in the 2016 contract of 15 days per annum, but you will also get regular teaching and training sessions provided locally, which constitute some of that study leave allowance. In the 2002 contract, there's no stipulation, but what we typically find is that the statutory education bodies in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland set out a policy that determines it, and it will be quite similar to that F1 situation in England. Wherever you go, the deanery or the education provider is likely to have a particular study leave policy. Ideally, these things are national, but there may be particularities for that individual organisation. And therefore, we would recommend that if you know where you're going, that you try and obtain a copy of that study leave, so that you know what exactly you should be getting in terms of leave, study budget, funding, how you claim it, etc. And similarly, when you undertake your foundation programme, there is likely to be a specific travelling and relocation expenses policy. When you rotate, you may be entitled to relocation expenses or excess travel. And if you travel in hours during work, say you are doing home visits, etc., if you happen to be in a GP context, then you will be able to claim that as business expenses. And again, we'd recommend that you obtain a copy of the relevant policy for your deanery, your education provider, just so that you're clear on what you're entitled to. Sick pay, this is contractual, and in the NHS at least, the provisions are quite generous. Initially, if you've been working for between 4 and 12 months, contractual sick pay is 1 month's full pay followed by 2 months half pay. If you're unable to work after this period, your income will be based on statutory sick pay, and then eventually nil. You will increase the amount of sick leave allowance that you get the longer that you work in the NHS. So it will increase from that point. You'll join the NHS pension scheme automatically when you start work. Only basic pay is pensionable, and pension contributions are subject to tax relief. Again, this will all come out and be set out in your payslip. The pension contributions will vary based on your pensionable pay. As an F1, your employee contribution will typically be about 7.1% of your pensionable pay. You are able to opt out of the pension, but certainly we would advise that you speak to a pensions advisor or financial advisor before you make any decisions in that regard. And finally, just to highlight that you can get tax relief from certain items. So your BMA membership subscription, you can claim tax relief from that. Any GMC registration fees, any Royal College membership fees, any medical indemnity that you have, typically you will all be able to claim that as work-related tax expenses and therefore get tax relief on it. You do that through the HMRC website, and again, you can always get financial advice on that and similar matters if you want help. So I just wanted to talk about contract reform as well, just to highlight that we have ongoing negotiations at the moment, and that stems from the 24-25 pay deal that we did in Wales following industrial action. This has been a significant and lengthy exercise. We have done a lot of engagement with membership, including online events, going to workplaces and talking to resident doctors, online surveys, reviewing existing BMA policy, looking at what went wrong with the previous attempt to do this in Wales in 2022 and trying to build on the lessons from that. That has all fed into a mandate that has been formulated and agreed by the Welsh Resident Doctors Committee in the BMA, a committee that is elected by resident doctors in Wales. And again, it's something that you can stand and vote in once you start work as an F1. That committee has set the mandate, and that is being used by appointed negotiators who are typically elected reps, as well as experienced BMA staff in order to negotiate. And we have been updating members on the progress. We'll continue to do that. And if there is any agreement, then that will be put to BMA members, and that will include final year medical students at the time. If at this point you're an F1, then you will get a vote. But in order to get a say in any contract, it is important to note that you will have to be a BMA member, and you need to make sure that your details are up to date. So, for example, making sure that you are set as living and working in Wales, and that you're a resident doctor when you become one. So, diolch yn fawr. Our website and our email address are there for you to utilise. And you can scan the QR code there to join the BMA if you're not already a member. Diolch yn fawr.